Well, hello everybody. This is Crystal. So from the Economist article Reaching for the Sky, in the third to the last paragraph mentioned rent subsidies as a form of another government intervention. So in San Francisco, the city government actually has imposed many subsidizing programs to make housing affordable for low-income households and to increase their revenues for the producers at the same time. So imposing price ceiling is very likely to reduce the supply of rent-controlled units and might lead to a potential shortage. So subsidies, in this case, they can come in and help to eliminate that shortage, but it can be a very costly option as well. So today we're gonna explore about this topic a little bit more. So the general idea of these subsidies is the assistance by the government to individuals, including suppliers and consumers. And it can be in the form of a direct cash payment or loans with very low interest, usually below the market price for certain goods and services. And sometimes it can be a form of tax relief as well. So subsidy, just like price mechanism, it also helps to reallocate the resources in society by changing the signals and prices and therefore the quantity demanded and supplied of a certain good. So to me personally, it is very interesting to understand the mechanism behind different policies, including subsidy here. And it really makes me feel that being a policymaker perhaps is one of the most difficult jobs in the world because they always need to be very deliberate in calculating the potential consequences of a certain move. And many of the consequences sometimes can be unexpected, and we rarely know exactly what effect any policy decision will have. So coming up with good public policy is really, really difficult because oftentimes the amount of budget is limited and these policies have to be well designed and implemented for the whole entire well-being of millions of people. And as we continue to learn, you'll see every policy actually comes with its own cost and benefit. So anyways, let's go back to our topic. So why does the government grant subsidies in the first place? So we mentioned a little bit before because they hope to improve the allocation of resources in the society, right? But let's actually go deeper into some specific reasons. So unlike the price ceiling that is imposed to support consumers on the demand side, subsidies can actually be a good news for both of the parties. And particularly on the consumer side, it is usually designed to help those who are more vulnerable and those who are in need at the most. So in general, on the supplier side, subsidies will increase the supplier's revenue or income with higher prices. And on the demand side, low-income consumers will benefit because subsidies will lower down the price of a good paid by those consumers. So as a result of that, subsidies will encourage both production and consumption or support the growth of a certain industry and economy. And finally, it is a method to correct allocative inefficiency or market imperfections. But just like other policies, subsidy doesn't solve every single problem. It is not the ideal remedy because it also comes with both benefits and costs, as we said earlier. And now let's look at market outcomes. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, welfare that we lost, price and quantity before and after a subsidy is given. So initially, without government stepping in and providing a subsidy, we have our market equilibrium where supply and demand intersects. So we see at this level, when quantity demanded is represented by QE and price is right here at PE. So what would be the producer surplus and consumer surplus under this equilibrium scenario? So for timing purposes, I won't go into the detailed definition and the step-by-step method to find the area of surplus, but if you want to know about this, feel free to find the corresponding video that is dedicated to this particular topic. You'll find the answer in there. So for now, we know consumer surplus is this triangular area below the demand curve, and producer surplus is the area above the supply curve. And if now the government imposes a subsidy or a fixed payment to the supplier for each output or quantity that is being sold, That will mean for every single unit of quantity that is willing and able to supply, it will get a lower price than the original level. And the amount of subsidy is just this vertical gap between the two supply curves. And you'll be able to see for every single unit, the amount of subsidy is exactly the same. And it is a parallel downward shift, as you can see here. And if you're a math person, even though I'm not, I can give you this equation anyways. So my new supply curve here, knowing that it is represented by S2, is equals to S1 minus subsidy. So essentially, it is saying that if I were to grant a subsidy to a supplier, it functions to shift the entire supply curve by exactly the amount of this subsidy. So the demand curve stays the same and does not shift at all. So note already, we have a new equilibrium point being generated. So it is the point or the intersection where the original demand curve and our new supply curve meet together. So this green dot is our new equilibrium. And what do you observe about this price level at our new equilibrium here? Actually goes down, right? And let me ask you a question. So will the consumers or renters in this case be happy? Of course they are, right? Because now the price paid by these renters are down to this low level, and housing is becoming more affordable with the subsidies and the quantity supplied and sold increases to Q2. But you might wonder how that benefits the suppliers or the landlords, right? I imagine a lot of you might think at this lower price, it means that they're going to receive less payment than before, and that will mean that their revenues will likely to go down and profits will also go down. But remember, they receive a subsidy from the government. So the landlords can actually go to the government and ask for the money back. And in fact, what they eventually receive is the price PP. So way up here. So this PP is equal to the price paid by a consumer, PC, plus the per unit subsidy from the government. So to take San Francisco cities as an example, the city launched a housing program called Housing Choice Voucher. It is a locally administered program that assists very low-income family, the elderly, and also the disabled to afford decent housing. So people must be very low income in order to receive that subsidy. So according to the official website, a housing subsidy is paid to the landlord directly by the institution called SFHA. So that stands for San Francisco Housing Associations on behalf of the needed family. So the amount from the government is this vertical line. And a household will only pay the difference between the actual rent charged by a landlord and the amount subsidized by the program. So in this case, the PC, which generally doesn't exceed 40% of their adjusted monthly income. And when we add them up, the landlords altogether receive PP, this price. Okay, so just a very brief summary of what we got so far. So in this case, after a subsidy, more quantity is traded at this level, and consumers receive a much more affordable price compared to the pre-subsidy level. And producers receive a higher price, so they increase their income. So both sides are happy. So now you think it might be the end of the story, right? But actually it is not. If we want to see how that is going to affect the total welfare, we still have to look at the change in consumer surplus, producer surplus, and what happens to the government. So now when we're thinking about the source of these subsidies, they all come from the government, right? So what is the amount of subsidy or cost to the government in total? So recall we said that this vertical part is the per unit subsidy. So to figure out the total amount, we simply multiply the per unit cost with the total units. So simple and easy, just some high school geometry and algebra skill that you have already acquired. So the area is this rectangle. So now what is the current level of my consumer surplus? So if the definition for consumer surplus is the price that consumers are willing and able to pay less the actual price level. And notice already, this actual price level has changed by the subsidy, okay? And the consumer surplus will definitely change as well as a result. So now The surplus for the renters is represented by this big triangle. When we analyze the pre-subsidy housing market, we have already figured out the original consumer surplus. So the change is just the difference between these two big triangles. In the yellow part, this trapezoid is the change. So consumers are well off for sure. And if we use the same way to figure out the change in producer surplus, producers are also better off. And the increase in their surplus is represented by this amount. So previously, we talked about this amount of subsidy all come from the government. So it is essentially a burden on their own budget. But how the government gets these money is by collecting taxes from the taxpayer. So this rectangle is the cost to the government indeed, but keep in mind that this total cost of subsidy is also a burden on the taxpayers. And now, why do we say that subsidy is not an ideal policy? It is because this cost, or the rectangular area, is greater than the sum of the gain in producer surplus and consumer surplus. Or in other words, the total benefit that suppliers and consumers enjoy. And if I use a more concise conclusion to summarize this result, it is simply cost exceeds benefit. And that induces a loss in my total welfare. Okay? And that loss has an economic name called deadweight loss. So something that we have already mentioned last time in our Economist Explainer video. So as you can see, the taxpayers' money is not being used efficiently, as there is an allocated inefficiency, or perhaps more specifically, an over allocation of resources occurs. You might also wonder, so what? So if there's a huge cost to the government, and how does that relate to my own life? And it's none of my business, right? So first we said that when you think about it, this amount is the taxpayers' money. So if the cost is huge right now, it is likely for the taxes to rise in the near future. So people, or poor people especially, will be burdened by this increase in taxes. And there will be a hidden opportunity cost here. So considering the government's budget is limited, if cost on subsidy increases, the expenditure on other areas will likely to reduce. So infrastructure and other goods will be less funded, and that's going to affect your community, your neighborhood environment, and perhaps even your education. So that's why we said subsidy can be controversial, and it is generally centered around the debate on how the money should be used and allocated. There will always be people who think that this money could have spent elsewhere much more efficiently, but any policy will lead to potential conflicts, and none of them will make everybody happy, right? So finally, a more recent and perhaps more relevant example of government subsidy is the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. So since the COVID-19 pandemic started, fewer of the renters are paying rent. But for landlords, they still have bills to pay. So in the past several months, we see many renters protesting as they lose their jobs and cannot afford high renting prices. So the new rental assistance program is funded by the Federal Consolidated Appropriations Act that was passed in late December last year. So it provides rental assistance for households who have lost their job and had a significant reduction in income due to COVID-19. So the program provides up to 12 months of assistance that's paid directly to the landlord or property manager. So in total, it provides up to over $21 billion under the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, which became effective several months ago this year. So we can see that this is actually a huge amount of influx of funding from the government directly. But since the affordable housing crisis is becoming more severe, government subsidy perhaps is the best response to quickly address the household rental debt that's accumulated during the crisis. So thank you so much for staying and bearing with me. I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you like the video, please leave a comment down below. And please remember to like and subscribe. And I hope to see you next time. Ciao.